ahead and get things kicked off. Hello, welcome to the SANS Emergency Webcast, what you need to know about the SolarWinds Supply-Chain Attack. My name is Rob Lee. I'm the head of faculty and chief curriculum director at the SANS Institute. Global incidents involving multiple victims are rare, but when they do occur, SANS will do emergency webcasts highlighting critical facts and details regarding the incident, what you should know, and how to investigate, protect yourself. We have asked longtime SANS instructor and offensive operations and incident response expert, Jake Williams, to help lead this webcast. Jake's research was aided by many in the instructor team, including the Internet Storm Center. Jake is a personal friend who consistently whittles down complex information to the core facts and details that you need to know so you can leave the talk with key actions that you could put to work immediately. Thank you for attending, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker, Jake Williams.
Thanks, Rob. Hey, Kate, if you can turn on my video there, that'd be outstanding. Otherwise, like Rob said, I'm here with the SANS Institute. And as Rob said as well, definitely this was aided by a huge number of folks over on the SANS Institute faculty side. I'll mention here as we get started that this is an evolving situation, and it's obviously something that is going to something that's going to change over time. Obviously, more is going to become known as days progress, and if additional information becomes available that warrants follow-up briefings, we're going to see those announced through SANS communication channels, including obviously email and Twitter, all the normal stuff that you've come to expect. Thank you very much, Kate. Appreciate it. To Rob's point here, I even have a slide on this. It takes a village, right? So I want to give the first just huge kickoff disclaimer here and say that most of what you're going to see today, it's not original research, right? I've tried not to publish stuff here that I haven't independently confirmed, but where I've done that, I definitely will be explicit about that as well. But I do want to mention here, the SANS instructor team has been working behind the scenes, helping aggregating public information, as well as performing a lot of their own analysis. And it's absolutely fantastic to work with a team and be involved with a team like this. But I do want to highlight again, this would not be possible 24 hours into an event without the outstanding work of the researchers, both in and out of the SANS community, who are sharing information on what is a rapidly evolving and quite frankly, I don't want to say unprecedented because that's been thrown around a lot in 2020, but look, supply chain attacks are not, they're not common, right? And so this is definitely one that we're seeing not only it being a software supply chain attack, but also one of the more damaging ones, potentially damaging ones in recent memory. So again, want to give a huge shout out to all the folks behind the scenes, both in and out of the SANS community, who have been doing great work and sharing information, because at the end of the day, it's information sharing on the security researcher and security, the defensive side, right? That's going to keep us in the game against these very, very sophisticated adversaries. I'm pretty confident at this point, at least through what I've seen and some stuff that I've seen that's not necessarily public yet. I'm pretty confident at this point attributing this to Russia, very specifically SVR, for that kind of to that point, I really at this point feel comfortable there, and I think it's also worth mentioning too then that these are folks that have infinitely more budget than any one organization that they're going to go target. And so this information sharing piece is absolutely critical as we move forward. And I have to give a huge hat tip to FireEye, for their transparency, both in the breach announcement last week, as well as the information that they've been publishing, since this broke last night. So again, just hats off to everybody involved in sharing data. And it's just a beautiful thing to watch a community come together like this, because even a few short years ago, this was just not the case. So what are we here to talk about today, right? SolarWinds breach. Yesterday, December 13th, Chris Bing from Reuters broke the story the Treasury Department had been compromised by a sophisticated adversary. I mean, how often do we hear that, right? Sophisticated adversary, and yet this time, no question, right? Ellen Nakashima is one of the best sourced national security reporters anywhere. She is the reason, I say the reason, she is definitely one of the biggest reasons that I have an active Washington Post subscription, because she's just well-resourced or well-sourced. And she very quickly got folks, basically to confirm that the Treasury Department breach was perpetrated by the same group that targeted FireEye. She also is the person that independently broke earlier that FireEye had been targeted by APT29, which is a Russian SVR. Some folks may know them as Cozy Bear. So a little bit different group than APT28, that's GRU. And that's basically, that's normally referred to as, or you hear it referred to very often as Fancy Bear. So again, different group, but understand as well, from a Russian national targeting standpoint, if you're looking at in the interest of the Russian government, definitely here that's what we would typically attribute. So outstanding work to Chris and Ellen as well. Before we move any further, it's probably worth mentioning, what is SolarWinds? We want to kind of level set this for everybody. SolarWinds is a software company primarily deals in systems management tools used by IT professionals. Now, perhaps the most widely deployed SolarWinds product would be Orion. Orion's a network management system. And I want to be clear here, when we say NMS, right, in security, we often refer to something called an NSM, a network security monitor. NSM and NMS obviously can be confusing. In fact, on the first draft of slides that I kicked over, I had actually transposed those two letters because the vast majority of the time, being a security person, vast majority of the time I'm typing NSM versus NMS, and sure enough, had made one of those typos. So again, takes a village, and spot on with the team there catching that. That was outstanding. Anyway, so the Orion NMS, that's the SolarWinds network management system. This has broad capabilities for monitoring and managing systems. This is going to include servers, workstations, network devices, everything, right? Now, not every organization is going to have SolarWinds configured identically, but when they do, right, or when they do have SolarWinds configured, it is definitely a great targeting point for attackers to go. One of the reasons for this is obviously, in order to monitor systems, that they have to do some type of system interrogation. Now, at the very, very base level, it may be something just as simple as a ping command, but that doesn't really provide any information. It's just binary. Either the ping succeeded or it didn't. What we're really looking for in the majority of cases is the status of individual, let's say, communications links, right? And if maybe one of those communication links dies, you may want to do, let's say, a shut, no shut, assuming like a Cisco, a Cisco line there. And of course, here, in order to do that, now we need the ability to go and take actions on these machines. And so SNMP is a very common way to do this. We also see WMI being used, and then there are agents that you can install on managed systems. And so the SolarWinds boxes become, in any network management system for that matter, become very, very juicy targets for attackers, right? Very juicy targets for attackers. So again, unsurprising that an attacker would target a network management system. Certainly in our red team exercises, we've done that. And I'll tell you that the vast majority of times we see these not really configured with security in mind. These are something that operations teams configure. We'll come back to that as we kind of close, rather than security teams. And if you're familiar with RACI, basically this is a spot where ops is generally responsible. And I'll be honest and say that in a lot of cases, the security team isn't consulted, or in some cases even informed of the basically of the configuration and any configuration changes on these network management systems. And maybe one of the big takeaways from this event is going to be more involvement between our IT and IT security folks in trying to really, level, kind of level set. Hey, what risk are we taking on, with these network management systems? So that said, who uses SolarWinds? Maybe the better question is, who doesn't use SolarWinds? Because when you start talking about network management systems, SolarWinds is so prevalent that it's almost to NMS what like Kleenex is to tissues, right? I don't quite want to say like Coke to cola, because that's probably a little bit too much market share, but again, they really are one of, if not the de facto network management system. So, when you look here, this comes right off of SolarWinds' own website, 300,000 plus customers. And as you start drilling into these, there's a lot of heavy hitters, again, Department of Defense, is a heavy hitter. These folks are just all over the federal government, and not to mention private industry, and again, lots of customers worldwide. So let's talk quickly about NMS. Why are NMS prime targets for attackers? First off, the network management systems have to be able to communicate with all devices being managed and monitored. And so this is a prime location. If you're moving towards a zero trust model, for instance, in your networks, and we have to assume that a number of folks are, we've seen security really ramp up, over the last several years, then attackers need to worry about these inter-VLAN access control lists, at an IP layer and even a layer 4, layer 4 standpoint. But the reality here is, because the network management system, the NMS, must be able to communicate, these outbound ACLs are ineffective, right? Many NMS are configured to both monitor for events and respond to them. This means that the network management system can make changes on behalf of its configuration. Now, a lot of folks on the security side I've seen several, tweets, and I've been on 2 calls today where some security folks are like, man, we gave this way too much power. And I'm like, my friend, have you looked at security orchestration, automation, and response, SOAR, right? There are whole platforms out there that we're giving as much, if not in many cases, more control, over individual actions on devices. Typically, an NMS, realistically, is monitoring for, processes to be running appropriately, services to be running appropriately, and will restart those as needed. Now, of course, in order to restart a service, in many cases, we need elevated credentials. And I'll be honest and say that in most NMSs that we audit, right, at my company, I'll mention that most are far over provisioned, right? So, in the case of restarting a service, you can get very granular with permissions around who can restart a particular service. But the easy button is to simply give it local admin, right? Is to give the account, give the SolarWinds box a local admin account onto the machine where that's needed, and then simply not worry about any more in-depth configuration, right? So it's important to know, right, and to realize from a threat modeling standpoint that anything the NMS can do, right, basically your attacker can do as well once they compromise that network management system. We've seen some reports, around through Microsoft, especially, about SAML being used there. And so, basically where an attacker will then create their own SAML token, and then they can access everything inside of Office 365, or anywhere for that matter. The SAML token is allowed. And so when you think about this all makes sense. Again, we're looking at basic compromise of certificates and basically those authentication principles. It makes sense that once the attacker has those, they can do anything that the system would be able to as well. Now, it's worth mentioning here as well that even when NMS are monitor only, meaning that they're not going to make any changes on behalf of a network admin or system admin, they still offer a level of access to the attacker. Typically, this allows the attacker to go read configurations, grab a process list, etc. I have story upon story of basically pivoting from using SNMP read-only credentials, onto system access, right? So it's one of those spots where a lot of folks really don't threat model that appropriately. I'll ask you coming out of this to really open your mind to really taking a hard look at those threat models. An attacker compromises that NMS can usually reshape network traffic for man-in-the-middle or person-in-the-middle opportunities, monkey-in-the-middle, whatever we're working with today. But man-in-the-middle opportunities that can use credentials for system monitoring and laterally move, very often use those credentials and laterally move to other systems. Now, this is a spot where I've answered this question about 15 times today, it feels like, with different folks. They're like, hey, we only have networking devices, right, configured for SolarWinds. SolarWinds doesn't have any credentials, or we don't run SNMP on our Windows servers. It can't get over to any of our Windows stuff. Are we okay? And my answer there is still potentially not, right? An attacker can very easily, if they have read-write access, to a network device or configuration change access, which is again very common, so that the SolarWinds system can, or the Orion server can resolve a fault that's detected. It would be very easy for an attacker to basically reshape traffic on the local network and position themselves for those man-in-the-middle opportunities, right? And so we know from from security from security practices that once you have man-in-the-middle, it's effectively just time and space before the attacker gets on gets on the machine. So again, just want to kind of throw that out there. Even if it's just networking devices, again, it's still offering the attacker quite a bit of opportunity. So then we have to worry about other things like, again, is the Orion server domain joined? If it is, are there service accounts there that an attacker could leverage to laterally move within the environment also? So let's talk about how the SolarWinds malware was deployed. We know at this point the malware was deployed as part of an update from SolarWinds' own servers and was digitally signed by basically a valid digital certificate bearing their name. Now, this strongly points to a supply chain attack. We'll talk a little bit more about that. We actually did the inaugural SANS Supply Chain Security Summit. I believe it was it last year or the year before? I can't remember. All my years are running together now. But alas, did the inaugural Supply Chain Security Summit. And again, did a lot of great work there, had a lot of great presentations from different folks. This is obviously a risk. It's not a risk that's going away. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes here. I'll just mention here that I don't think that the certificate itself was likely compromised. I think it's more likely the build process inside of SolarWinds was likely compromised. But some folks have been asking me today, do you think the certificate is going to be revoked? And I think it probably needs to be at some point. But this is obviously a dynamic, kind of environment here. A lot is going to depend on what SolarWinds investigation uncovers. Regardless here, revoking the certificate now, is unlikely to do a lot here. This isn't a case where we know that an attacker compromised the certificate and is then using it to deploy software or malware, right, through their own channels. In this case, that they were actually deploying it through SolarWinds' own, own distribution channels. So this is a spot where, again, revoking the certificate maybe not going to help there, at least not immediately. Separately, hunting for this certificate, while useful, is likely to show up with lots of other SolarWinds signed software. And so here we find ourselves in this very very difficult to investigate scenario. That's what supply chain breaches are unfortunately all about, right? So if you're following this information or following information on the breach, there's a few hashtags to follow for breaking information: SolarWinds and SolarWinds Orion. There's also UNC 2542. Now, this UNC designation is the designation that FireEye gives threat groups that are unknown or that they have unattributed up to that point. And I say unknown, meaning that they don't. Basically, they've clustered, a group of activity tools, et cetera. They're tracking, and they've separated that out from the broader sense of all capabilities, all attacks, et cetera, that are seen. But they don't have it attributed back to a specific group yet. Right. So I'll mention here that others have publicly attributed this to APT29, which is Cozy Bear and Russian SVR. I've had some folks ask me today, which one's right? I just have to say, I don't know that it matters specifically, right? FireEye has a very, very high standard for attribution, much higher, in fact, than most, right? And so I think it's worth mentioning that, it is, most of the data available points pretty strongly towards Russian SVR, but at the end of the day, if that's not the case, right, it really doesn't, basically doesn't matter. Robert Emley, excuse me, the granddaddy of the SANS CTI course, basically has the old Simpsons test when it comes to attribution. And he says, look, if I told you it was the Simpsons, will that change how you're going to investigate this or basically look at this particular incident? And people usually look at him like he's got three heads, but I love this analogy when it comes to the attribution side. He's like, if I told you it's Russia or I told you it's the Simpsons, how are you going to act differently? And if the answer is you're not, then does the attribution really matter at that point, right? I mean, from a grouping standpoint, yes. From it's Russia, again, governments, nation states, this makes sense that you're going to go and use that data. But honestly, most commercial organizations, this is not a useful, useful separation. So, how was SolarWinds breached? This is a piece of information that we do not have yet. And I'll say this is not the first time that we've seen a state-backed advanced persistent threat targeting software vendors or masquerading as an update to deploy their malware payloads. We have two in the past that are Russian attributed, not Petya, where the basically, in this case, I believe attributed to Fancy Bear, had targeted MEDOC which is a Ukrainian software company that's used for paying taxes in Ukraine. You're probably familiar with this scenario. If you're not, Andy Greenberg's book Sandworm does an outstanding job of covering it. It's very, very accessible. My mom read it and she was comfortable with it. My mom can brick a phone from 30 feet by looking at it wrong. If she can get through it, so can you, but still provides a lot of great technical information as well in an easily digestible manner. Alas, not Petya, outstanding there. I say outstanding, outstandingly damaging, and also outstanding tradecraft, honestly, right? If you want to take down or cause disruption across, an entire area, they found a great central distribution point for that. That attack shares a lot of similarities with what we're seeing with the SolarWinds Orion issue, in that specifically the update that was pushed through MEDOC waited to beacon, right? So even if you were doing everything right and installing your updates manually in an offline test bed, even an online test bed for that matter, before deploying them into prod, you would have to wait for days before this thing was going to beacon, and even then, it didn't beacon often, right? So meaning you weren't seeing, like, it wasn't very chatty. It wasn't like you started it up and bam, it's like beaconing out to command and control. We see the same thing, by the way, and I'll talk more about this in a few minutes. We see the same thing here with the Sunburst malware, which is what was deployed with basically the SolarWinds, the SolarWinds updates. Bad Rabbit was a masquerade only. Russia's not the only game in town here, by the way. Bad Rabbit, by the way, masqueraded as a Flash update. Thankfully, Flash is dead or soon to be dead. This won't be an issue for long. But there are also China-attributed attacks as well. Targeting back to CCleaner. We also have Shadowpad and Shadowhammer. Those targeted NetSarang, and Shadowpad was NetSarang, and I believe Shadowhammer was the ASUS updater. And so again, we have a lot of examples of software supply chain attacks that have become publicly known. I want to caveat here that there's two reasons I'm talking about this. One, because I'll tell you that I suspect that we are going to see a lot more of this. We know that organizations are getting better at security, particularly the top tier organizations that a lot of these attackers want to get into. We know they're getting better with security, right? Yes, you can say, oh, phish users all day long, and eventually somebody will click. But that will also get investigated very quickly, right? Software supply chain attacks are ridiculously hard to investigate. I've worked a couple involving remote support software. I can't mention specific vendors here, but I'll tell you that they're devilishly difficult to investigate. And so here, I'm in the same boat here of, we see these attackers now, at least these two groups, or at least these two nations, groups, if not others, right, that we have not yet seen. So I would also hypothesize that there are probably other active software supply chain attacks now that are ongoing that we simply haven't yet seen. Again, like I said, very just devilishly difficult to detect for just a lot of reasons here. Now, SolarWinds, because they're a publicly traded company, they've published a response with or filed with the SEC. And so we do get some information from them. And I'll mention here that SEC filings are one of those things that you can just take to the bank, right? As much as we can, any piece of, I'm obviously suspicious anytime, or at least suspicious or at least cynical anytime I read, a vendor saying, oh, well, here's the details of our breach. But when it goes to the SEC, that's not spin. Right? Because, if you're materially misrepresenting that information, that's go to jail kind of stuff, right? So anyway, basically here, SolarWinds has identified that these updates that were released between March and June 2020 were the only ones that represent some level of compromise, or would have, ultimately placed malware onto user systems. This leaves me with more questions than, honestly, this filing has left me with more questions than I had before I read the filing. Very specifically here, it's obviously December. We're just finding out about this in December. How did they boot the attackers out of this build process or whatever, where the attackers were there from March to June, but then are no longer there? And there's a lot of questions here. Obviously, SolarWinds is going to be publishing more data, as they continue their own internal investigation. Good news, again, with them being a publicly traded company, we will learn details about this breach, which is going to be great from a case study standpoint for future software supply chain and preventing future software supply chain attacks. Now, SolarWinds mentions that while they have, around 300,000 customers, only about 33,000 of them have active support, basic active support or maintenance contracts. And so that means that those are the only folks that are getting the updates, right? So they now have identified the number of folks that would have had a relevant installation to be, fewer than 18,000, right? I again believe you can take this number to the bank. You would have had to log in most cases to go get that, basically to go get that software. And so I say log in to go get the software, excuse me, to use that, effectively use that software. I think this is probably a relatively solid number. And at the same time, 18,000 is terrifying, right? Because we're talking about 18,000 organizations that may now have a compromised network management server that would provide a very capable adversary keys to the kingdom, right? So I don't want to, I don't want to downplay this and say only 18,000. At the same time, it's at least it's only 18,000. So one thing that I am going to jump on SolarWinds, and by the way, these again are ridiculously difficult breaches to investigate. The one thing I will ping on them here a little bit about is they talk about this being a vulnerability. It is not a vulnerability, right? Make no mistake about it. The attacker put code into the SolarWinds distribution. That's just a backdoor. That's malware. It's not a vulnerability, right? But okay, maybe I'm mincing words here, or whatever. Look, you probably know about CISA issuing an emergency directive to mitigate the compromise of Orion on our basic government systems. Now, look, if you're in the civilian sector, you don't have to listen to DHS, but you should, right? You absolutely should be following this. And the way that I've been, working with my customers today on this has been basically just, and late last night as well, but has been to say, look, we know that here's the recommendation that DHS is pushing down to basically to government recommendation, nothing. Here's the directive, the order that they're pushing down to these other government agencies. There's stuff like, hey, you need to go grab a memory snapshot. You need to basically ensure that regardless of the version of the network management server that you have in use, you need to make sure that it can't talk directly to the internet. They've got a list of things. You should be doing this, right? And if you're going to zig left or zag right, fine, but document why you're doing it. From a liability perspective, let's be serious about this, right? DHS is operating with data we do not have. There's no question about that. And we can look at those recommendations and say, okay, if DHS, with knowledge that we don't have, is saying these are the steps you should take, and you're not taking those steps, you probably want to justify and memorialize like why we're not following those recommendations there. So that's been one of my pushes here has been, hey, go download the report, go download the recommendations, take a look at what DHS is saying, and then roll from there. Now, network IOCs. I do want to mention here that FireEye, again, hats off to FireEye, right? Actually, before I get into the technical IOC side, I want to throw out there that for whatever it's worth, FireEye has dealt a major blow to Russian intelligence with this. There's no question that, obviously information on Treasury, information on other government agencies, and I am confident that we will learn about other government agencies breached, by this, by Cozy Bear over the coming weeks. This is critical intelligence for them to have, particularly during an administration change. And the fact that they took this away right before the change, and then there's very little question as well that, especially given the Russian attribution here, that this is a basically that we're moving into an administration that may be less friendly to Russia at the very time that they need this information the most. FireEye took it away from them. And so hats off to FireEye, right? Again, I don't have a single bad thing to say about them in the way that they've handled this, nothing but kudos. In fact, I tweeted earlier today, if you worked at FireEye and you are in any way involved in this, from proofing a blog post to doing threat hunting, catch up with me at the next conference that we're at together. Drinks are on me. Because again, this is just driving it home to Russia, and just happy about that. But want to note here on the snort rules that FireEye released, right? There are unique domains for Sunburst, which is the malware that was included with Orion, as well as Beacon, which is another tool, a follow-on tool that FireEye has identified in the report. Now, what you're seeing here then, notice there's no overlap here in these, domains. And so one of the things that you can take away from here is that the attacker is absolutely trying to segregate, basically their initial stage from their follow-on stages, right? This is going to become significant as we start looking at looking at what do we need to do to identify these attackers in the network. Now, this is great from a discovery course of action standpoint. Discovery COA is looking back, detection is looking forward. And again, this is a spot where, if you have DNS logs or full take packet capture, be on the lookout for this stuff. That said, I don't think that it's sufficient for us to step back and say, I don't see it, therefore we're good, right? There's a big difference there, between a positive hit and nothing, right? Nothing just means you don't see it. I don't believe for a minute these are the full list of all domains that were used. And again, these attackers have already shown that they'll stand up individual infrastructure on a per target basis. And so we may not find any of these. We may find yet other domains, again, particularly on a per target basis, is going to make it more difficult to hunt. Right. Also, I'll mention that from a detection moving forward standpoint, we know that the Russian APT groups have been great at counterintelligence over the years. Counterintelligence meaning that they are watching for others reporting about them being detected and then changing their indicators of compromise as that moves. Bear in mind, you're not playing the same game necessarily that, basically we found out about this yesterday. But bear in mind, the Russians, the folks who are behind this, or UNC 2540, or sorry, 2452, if we want to just go there, basically as FireEye announced, or say FireEye announced, as the FireEye breach was disclosed, at that point, the attacker knew the gig was up, right? And so they've had, let's say, at least a week, if not earlier, if they had seen FireEye doing some of their own incident response internally, they've had time to already start migrating away. I don't think you're going to find any of this stuff moving forward. It's only going to be through looking back. And maybe that's one of our takeaways, is that we need better retention on some of our logging, and we need to really think about looking at the indicators that we get in an incident like this and saying, how can we operationalize these? Do we have the logs to operationalize these all the way back, by the way, to March, right? Because that's when SolarWinds says they believe the first impacted, or basically the first impacted update went out. So attackers are sophisticated. Yes, I know we hear this with every breach, but in this case, they are sophisticated, right? Look, this includes sophistication both on behalf of the development and the operational teams. We've seen times in the past where a very sophisticated operational team does wonders with commodity malware. We've seen cases in the past where development teams are outstanding. They turn over, like the equivalent of an F-35, over to a Cessna pilot, and you get predictable results, right? Look, we throw the term APT around a lot. This is it, all right? Just let's level set. This is it. The operational teams have used specific infrastructure for each victim. They're reducing the usefulness of network-based IOCs and possibly other IOCs as well, right? We don't know as much about file system side. That's harder to hunt for in general. So anyway, but I expect that there's a lot of variation in the tooling. FireEye even mentions in the report that a lot of the tooling they're seeing here in this incident does not share code with other known samples. This probably is one of the reasons that this still falls in UNC 2452 versus APT 29 until they can make that linkage, right, from a development side. This still may yet be another group. Again, I feel fairly confident here based on some of what I've heard out of band that this is at least Russian state actor, or a Russian state actor, but again, which one and the specifics of it probably don't matter to the majority of us. Now, as far as we get into some of the craziness here, with operational security, I want to start with delayed execution. FireEye notes that the malware checks file system timestamps to ensure the product has been deployed for 12 to 14 days before it does its first beacon. Now, this does a few things. This effectively prevents the use of malware sandboxes or other instrumented environments to detect it. So I told multiple customers today that even if you were doing everything right, even if you were saying, hey, every time we're going to go update this thing, we're going to go and deploy the update in a staging environment, right? And we're going to leave it in the staging environment for a few days or a couple hours or whatever, and make sure it's not immediately beaconing out. Nobody's doing it for 12 to 14 days. And honestly, if you were, and that became policy, these folks are playing a long game, right? And they will adapt to that. This is already what you're seeing here, right? I have no doubt, I assess with high confidence that this 12 to 14 day waiting period is here specifically to prevent detection in high security environments where that type of pre-deployment testing is being done, right? And so again, the 12 to 14 also matters for me because it's not like 12 days after you install, bam, okay, we're going. There's some variation there, right? So again, a little bit of randomization that matters there. Again, just phenomenal work by the FireEye team releasing this, and also, again, shows some evidence of a very capable actor. Anti-sandbox behavior, right? So FireEye notes that unless the machine is joined to a domain, the malware won't execute. We've seen this a lot in different keyed malware samples that are tied to specific environments. Here, because basically this is being deployed to a lot of environments, 18,000 by FireEye's own estimate. Here they're looking for, because they don't know which environment specifically it's going to, they are checking at a minimum to make sure that the machine is domain joined. Now, I'm positive, and in fact, even across my customer space, I can point to a couple of network management systems that aren't domain joined, and in which case, this particular heuristic is going to keep the attacker off those systems. By the way, I am not recommending that you go and unjoin your, system from the domain. That certainly is not what I'm looking NMS from the domain there. But it is an interesting technique here that we're seeing as yet another stage of trying to evade basically malware sandboxes. But my favorite one that FireEye published on, has to be the DNS Resolution IP Address checks. Basically, FireEye noted that if the malware resolves a domain to a private IP address, it will not execute. Now, if you've ever used a malware sandbox before, you know that most of them intercept traffic and then reroute that traffic basically so that they can capture all the command, basically any like exfiltration data and that kind of stuff, right? What I like here is that most of these are RFC 1918 IP addresses, right? They're private IPs, there's a multicast, but then you move into the bottom ones, the ones we have highlighted, right? And these are all Microsoft IP addresses. I mean, I'm not saying these are all of Microsoft's IPs. Obviously, that's probably too small of a range, but every one of those IP address ranges is tied back to Microsoft. So if you happen to work in Microsoft security or you know someone who does, give them a pat on the back, because obviously these attackers looked and like, yeah, no, we're just not even playing that, right? Now, I've actually read a couple of tinfoil hat theories, where folks are like, well, that's because it was probably the US that was working with, Microsoft and the whole, that's ridiculous. Let's just stop that right now. That's not it. But again, hats off to Microsoft here, just fantastic work. And again, it's always interesting when you have an attacker who recognizes the level of basically the level of their opponent and just says, yeah, I'm just not even coming to play there. And that's exactly what you see here built into the Sunburst malware. So, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher this gentleman's name, but Kyle Hensloven has published a list of paths for this SolarWinds Orion Core Business Layer. Wow, that's a mouthful. .dll. This thing is all over the place, right? And so as far as paths that should be there, basically Kyle posted this, and he got it from a friend in an MSP, but I don't think that gentleman's name was public. Regardless, bottom line here, there's a lot of different paths this can be in. I posted a link here so you can go grab those. Obviously, the slide deck will be there, or you can just go search for Kyle, and I'm sure you'll see his, see a link to his GitHub gist. But this is helpful in knowing where should this DLL legitimately be, because first I'm trying to find out, do I have basically, do any of the YARA rules that FireEye has released, do they match on that DLL or the hashes? The first step one is finding it, right? And so again, this just hats off, great work here, love it, right? So want to kind of circle back now on recommendations. If you have SolarWinds Orion, you should assume compromise. Until more is known, I would not assume it's just the published versions that are compromised. I saw several questions before we went live about, hey, how confident are we that earlier versions weren't compromised? How confident are we that the hot patch is going to remove, any trace of an attacker? Well, let's go ahead and break that down for a minute. SolarWinds, statement today to filing today to the SEC, honestly leaves me with more questions than answers, right? So from a question standpoint, I don't understand, basically how they determined that they removed an attacker, no later than July, obviously, since the last published range there is June. And yet this didn't somehow come to light in the meantime, right? So, there's a few different possibilities there rattling around in my head. I'm not going to hypothesize about that too much because at the end of the day, we're going to come to learn that. It's not something where, we'll debate the possibilities and it'll become a drinking game or whatever. This is just that, right? So anyway, again, until we know better. I would say if you have SolarWinds Orion, I think you probably should assume compromise. I am not comfortable even with their filing, assuming that it's just the published versions that are compromised. If you have other SolarWinds products, but not Orion, this is one of these spots where I want to go and think about my attack surface, and I want to think about, what else might have been compromised. Now, from an attacker standpoint, I'm not sure how many other SolarWinds products it really makes sense, to compromise through a supply chain attack, right? This already offers keys to the kingdom, huge customer base. And even if we assume that the attacker took down 18,000 or put beachhead accesses, very important beachhead accesses in 18,000 organizations, I mean, I don't know that there's a big value proposition for them going, further down the chain here. This is almost like, again, or would almost be for me thinking about, somebody who, basically breaks into a jewelry store and they've already taken all the diamonds and they're like, hey, give me all the nickels out of the cash register there, right? It's like, I mean, sure, you can take them with you, but like, does it even make sense at that point? And I'm not sure that it does. At the same time, from a threat modeling standpoint, you should be modeling that particular risk and then asking, on the IT ops side, because that's typically where these tools are used, basically, is the functionality we're getting out of these, is that basically, does the risk outweigh the functionality, or does the functionality outweigh the risk, right? And have an adult discussion about that. I'll tell you that east-west NetFlow is going to be a limited value here. The network management servers, they're talking to too many devices in most cases. I even have orgs where, to increase retention on east-west NetFlow, because there's a lot of it, they'll remove very talkative servers from those long tail logs. In which case, that means that my NMS is probably in that, right? So I think it's going to be very difficult to do. That said, I mean, you could, if you have those logs, you can absolutely threat hunt through those looking for anomalies because they're likely to be there. But we're going to block access from the network management system to the internet, right? That should have already been done. And this doesn't just apply to your NMS. It honestly applies to the vast majority of servers, right? Most of my servers, I don't want talking directly to the internet for a lot of reasons, software supply chain attacks included. I really want to limit my destinations that they can talk to, if indeed that they can talk at all. Now, that wouldn't have helped here, right? Because if we were set for auto update, we'd have downloaded the update from SolarWinds, right? This is such a tough environment here. Again, if I'm blocking access, to the internet with the intent of stopping all attacks, right? Great. That's not going to stop all attacks anyway, but it does, significantly limit our attack surface. If I only block it to, or I block and then allow select destinations, like for software update, bear in mind that's not preventing this type of, this type of attack, because again, we have a software supply chain compromise, right? So the well effectively is already poisoned. A second set of recommendations here. One, threat hunt your network, right? I already talked about, prioritizing the discovery course of action over the detection course of action, right? Discovery is looking backwards, detection is looking forwards. You have to look backwards here. This is a very capable group, right? It's a very capable group who are undoubtedly watching this webcast now. I have very little doubt about that. And also, for that matter, are following everything that's being published about this. And anything that they have IOC-wise that are burned, they've probably already been taking proactive inventory of that. As I mentioned before, the second the FireEye story broke, at latest, they already knew the gig was up, right? It was just time and space. And I'll bet good money that they were already making, and have a little bit of evidence to this effect, that they were already, making some changes in the way that they perform some operations. So this is a spot where even once you patch SolarWinds, even once you apply the hot fix that they're releasing tomorrow, that's great. That removes the back door, but you don't know what was done with the back door, and that's really the key here, right? We don't know what was done unless you have an EDR or some other flight data recorder type of system, on your network management server, as well as I'll mention, as well as good east-west NetFlow around it, and you have those logs backed all the way up to at least March of this year. I'm not confident that something else wasn't done on that system, right? So again, I'm thinking here, if that sounds like paranoia, I get it, and at the same time, it's not, right? We need to have a healthy dose of paranoia as we're really as we're thinking about threat hunting and risk modeling. Again, the attacker is very clearly OPSEC aware that they're changing these file system-based IOCs. They're likely changing the network-based IOCs as well. They're performing counterintelligence. Anything that's shared publicly, I'm not telling you not to implement it. I'm just telling you from an IOC standpoint, don't go fly the mission accomplished banner, right? When you do a search for those IOCs and you don't find anything, because the reality is that that's exactly what I expect, right? Now, if you find an IOC, game on, you got a hit, right? You don't find anything, don't walk away saying, woohoo, we're awesome, we're set, and then don't do that, right? Again, we have pretty clear indications that at least for some priority targets, there was infrastructure assigned on a per target basis. And again, as well, anything shared publicly, these folks are changing in real time. Attackers are going to be retooling. Again, I don't expect to find specifics around the Sunburst malware. Evan Diegert at SANS, he's one of the SANS instructors. He has basically pulled apart that binary. I dumped some of because it's a .NET binary. There was very little obfuscation in it, very little. Really, I don't want to say no obfuscation, but not really any obfuscation to speak of in there. And it really is not. I mean, there's malware you look at and you're like, whoa, right? And even when it's targeting you, as a malware analyst, right, I'm like, fist bump, right? Because I respect the player, right? And I got to tell you, looking at this, and I'm not grading anybody's work here, this just wasn't super sophisticated. It didn't need to be. The reality was, from an evasion standpoint, think about what all the obfuscation and super sophistication stuff is really meant to do. It's meant to go bypass EDR, right? It's bypass endpoint protection, right? It's get it through the door in the first place, right? So that as it's being detonated, as an email attachment, we're still good, right? That kind of stuff. And they don't have to worry about any of that here, right? You ran it as an administrator, trusted installer, to ultimately install this onto your servers. And even if some security product were actually running on your NMS, most aren't, and it gave you an alert, you would go, okay, but it's signed by SolarWinds and done. As of last night, even after FireEye published the hash for the Sunburst DLL, which was and again, huge mouthful there, but that big SolarWinds Orion whatever.dll we talked about earlier, basically we had 0 hits in virus total initially. And so, I think it was a few hours later, it got to 3. Again, this is kind of those wah, wah, wah kind of moments, right? And it really shows, how hard this stuff is to detect from a signature-based standpoint. So what if you don't have SolarWinds? You are in the potentially fortunate situation that you don't use Orion, but you have another network management server. Don't rest yet. Most network management servers are configured by operations. They almost always prioritize availability as part of the CIA triad. I'm not saying that's wrong. But I will say that this is a spot where we need security teams to come in and help threat model what those accesses can provide. This just isn't an ops wheelhouse. If you say to do threat model, great. That's again, it may not be meaningful there or as meaningful as security doing it. This is no longer theoretical. The compromise of a network management system is no longer theoretical. The compromise of one through a supply chain attack is no longer theoretical. Threat model it. And then part of that threat modeling is going to involve if an attacker compromises our NMS through another software supply chain attack, and don't limit this, by the way, to NMS. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But if they ultimately compromise an NMS through a software supply chain attack or other means for that matter, how am I going to detect it? This is part of my threat modeling exercise. Every time I go through and threat model, I want to know how then will I detect this? And again, this is going to be a big one for me. I have to go model that out and make sure I have the right logs in place. And then I have to use this as a case study to say it's December and SolarWinds is telling me that at least all the way back to March, right? Do I have 9 months of all of those logs, right? And in many cases, 10 months inclusive, right? And in many cases, the answer there is no, right? So this is a great point to kind of threat model and take a hard look at what you have both in logging to detect this and retention. Does it go back far enough, far enough as well? Now, I don't like to make technology predictions. They do not age well. Typically, is my experience. Technology predictions don't age well. But I'm confident in predicting that supply chain compromises are going to continue. attackers have seen that this works, right? Two nation states, and it appears stripped across multiple nation state groups at least, have targeted software supply chains, and have targeted these, I suspect, because again, we're getting better at security at the perimeter, and this is a great way to hit a lot of people. In the case of the Shadow Hammer with the ASIS updates, that was very, very targeted. Whereas, in this case, it doesn't appear to be explicitly targeted other than at SolarWinds, SolarWinds customers. So again, I'll also mention these are extremely difficult to detect. I think and protect against, for that matter. One thing, and feel free to quote me on this back to your executive board, whatever. If you find yourself, unfortunately, in the list of victims, that were compromised by this, I'm willing to kind of step up there and say, unless you're doing some other really, really nasty stuff inside the environment, whatever. Look, this is not something that most of us were going to prevent. I will go ahead and tell you that if I ran SolarWinds in my environment, I do not. We do run a network management server. We're not getting into which one, because good, well, yes, that good OPSEC. But look, if I ran SolarWinds in my environment at rendition, I will say, go on the record and say, I'd have been compromised by this as well, right? We in most cases do not deploy software directly to prod because that's a bad plan, right? Trademark bad plan. But even deploying that in a staging environment, again, this was looking for 12 to 14 days. We just don't do that, right? Now, obviously we're thinking now already about like, hey, how does this change our processes? I don't know how it's going to change our processes explicitly yet. More to come on that, right? And certainly I'll be transparent about some of that best practices that we're adopting internally. One thing that we do, every week is, chat about changes to our threat model, right? What do we know now that we didn't know before, and how does that change, how we're gonna act both, internally as well as for our customers, and I think that that's probably a smart move here as well, right? To take a look at this and say, hey, whether or not you use Orion, basically, how does this compromise of an NMS? How does that impact us going forward, right? And how are we going to change business, change the way we do business going forward? And again, here, I'm not positive, even, basically seeing the 12 to 14 day waiting period, I'm not positive going forward that I would, that I'm going to say, oh, well, that means we're going to go, test everything in staging for at least 3 weeks or something. Because again, this is just going to be a tit for tat kind of issue there. If enough defenders do that, then the time will change to 4 weeks, right? 4-week back off. And so again, I'm not sure what the right response here is yet, other than threat model. And again, very intentional thoughts around what risk we're taking and how we're going to mitigate that risk and detect an intrusion around that, right? So alas, as far as supply chain security compromises, one other note that I want to make here is SaaS applications. I've talked to a number of folks today that are, folks today that are like, oh, well, we moved into SaaS. And I'm like, okay, listen, I get it, right? Like, and by the way, there's not a lot of SaaS network management servers out there, but they're kind of expanding out and thinking like, what else could be from supply chain? They're like, well, don't worry, we're in SaaS. And I'm like, okay, I get it, right? But this is like that old adage, right? The cloud is just someone else's computer, right? Look, SaaS is it's not like they have some magic ability, in a SaaS provider to like, oh, SaaS provider, right? And like, it almost felt like a Pokemon card or something, or some type of gaming card, like pick up SaaS provider, get immediate immunity to software supply chain attacks, right? That's not how any of this works, right? The reality is these vendors are every bit as vulnerable to a software supply chain attack as you are. You're just moving the point of compromise out, right? So I'm not saying do use SaaS, don't use SaaS, any of that. All I'm saying is that threat model this and understand that your SaaS vendors have all the same issues that you do, both with detection as well as prevention, right? As far as an evolving situation, again, just a quick reminder here that basically if additional information becomes available that warrants follow-up briefings, those are going to be announced through SANS communication channels, including email and Twitter. So I'm sure there are other communication channels, carrier pigeon, what have you, but those are going to be the main ones that I could think of immediately. And with that, I'll just say thank you for attending. If we have time, I guess a facilitator, that would be Mr. Lee here. Rob Lee will come in and moderate questions. And if not, if he says we're done, then we are done. But in any case, I thank everybody for coming out here today. I have to give just a couple more shout outs before I turn it right back over to Rob. First, FireEye. I have never, in my history of working in incident response, I've never seen a company come out with the level of transparency and the speed, right? The speed and level of transparency that FireEye has, just amazing. Just hats off to you folks, outstanding work. And I have to say that I am not confident that had FireEye not been breached, by these attackers, that I'm not confident we know about the Treasury hack, and I'm not confident we know about the SolarWinds hack or breach here. And I got to say here, right? This is if you're looking for silver linings here, one of them is that FireEye was attacked, and the fact that they were, is what's opened up this whole other can of worms. And I suspect that there's probably some over the Kremlin right now, or at least in the last week, I hope over the last several hours, there have been some pretty uncomfortable discussions, with whoever made the decision that FireEye was, quote, worth the risk, right? So again, hats off to FireEye, outstanding work, every one of you, and I thank you for your service, because no joke, you are making our country a safer place. Secondarily, hats off to the SANS forensics team and the rest of the SANS faculty. Again, this kind of stuff doesn't go off without them. It doesn't go off without help in the background. Usually it's my team. Here it was like, bam, Rob's just like, nope, I've got it. He's like, whole faculty's working on this and cranking stuff out. Internet Storm Center, all kinds of folks here. And again, it takes a village. It would not have happened without them. Just thanks to them. And then thanks to everybody else in the community who's publishing information, because again, these folks who are attacking us, the folks who compromised SolarWinds, the folks that compromised FireEye, they have a budget that none of us individually can match. And this is asymmetric warfare. And the only way that we take a hurting back to them, right? And it puts a smile on my face to take a hurting back to Russia. But the only way we take a hurting back to them is by sharing information, right? When we silo this stuff, again, that plays to their advantage. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Mr. Lee. Thanks everybody for attending.
Thanks, Jake. Really appreciate your time last night. Pinged Jake around 7 p.m. to see if he was interested in taking this, and he immediately said yes. And then it was just a matter of trying to figure out the right time just before everyone's schedules where this landed at 5 p.m. We understand that a lot of people, because of timing, this is dinner time for a lot of people in the United States, definitely really poor timing for those in other parts of the world. This recording, this presentation is being recorded and is going to appear on YouTube. We're going to change the link at the sansurl.com/SolarWinds to point to the recording and any additional follow-up information that comes out. And if necessary, we'll do a follow-up webcast on any new breaking news regarding this. Really appreciate your time. We're not going to be able to have any time for questions tonight, just because we wanted to make sure we're giving Jake as many times. But everyone sees Jake's handle there for Twitter. Jake, I don't know how you do it, but you honestly are one of the most active people on Twitter that I know. And you take the time to, really respond and put a lot of thoughts on Twitter. And it's appreciated for what you do, not only for SANS, but for the entire community. We here at the SANS Institute, thank you. And I really appreciate you helping us lead this. For everyone else, thank you for attending the presentation. And we will follow up with any updates at the sansurl.com/SolarWinds. Thank you.